Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, members of the Commission. My name is Patty Thompson. Je suis la directrice générale de la Direction de l'évaluation et de la protection environnementale et radiologique. With me today are Mr. Andrew McAllister, the Acting Director of the Environmental Risk Assessment Division, Ms. Melanie Rickard, the Acting Director of the Radiation and Health Sciences Division. Mr. McAllister will make today's presentation. We're supported by a team of CNSC staff with expertise in reactor behavior and regulation and emergency management. Ontario Power Generation representatives are also present and available to answer questions. For this work, OPG was responsible for the dispersion modeling and the dose calculations. You will recall that staff conducted the study of consequences of a hypothetical severe nuclear accident and effectiveness of mitigation measures in response to direction from the Commission in the March 2013 record of proceedings for the environmental assessment of the refurbishment and continued operation of the Darlington Nuclear Generating Station. Our report was first presented to you on June 19, 2014, under CMD 14M30. Today's presentation provides an update on this study and is documented in CMD 15M10. Addendum A of the CMD is a table of comments received during the public review period and staff's responses to these comments. Addendum B is the updated revised study report for your consideration. I will now turn the presentation to Mr. McAllister.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson. For the record, my name is Andrew McAllister, and I am the Acting Director of the Environmental Risk Assessment Division. I will begin by providing a brief outline of our presentation. As you can see, the presentation includes background information around the reason for the study and its approach, as well as how the Commission and the public have been involved to date. This will establish the context for today's update meeting. This information is followed by a discussion of how CNSC staff addressed the direction from the Commission when we were before you in June 2014, as well as the results of the public consultation on the draft study, and how CNSC addressed the concerns raised during that process. The presentation will wrap up with CNSC staff's conclusions and next steps. The next few slides will cover off background information related to the study and what has been done to date. In December 2012, during the course of the hearings on the environmental assessment for the refurbishment and continued operation of the Darlington Nuclear Generating Station, interveners raised concerns over issues such as severity of the accident assessed, multi-unit accidents, adequacy of off-site emergency planning, including evacuation planning, and potential health effects to the public. During the hearings, CNSC staff confirmed that the nuclear accident that was assessed for human health and environmental consequences was credible and sufficient for the environmental assessment. However, staff did indicate that a more detailed examination of the severe accident was possible. Subsequently, in its March 2013 record of proceedings on the environmental assessment, the Commission directed staff to assess health and environmental consequences of severe accident scenarios and to update the Commission accordingly. The update to the Commission was to be in the form of an information document or equivalent. We presented the draft study to you as part of CMD 14M30 during the June 19, 2014 Commission meeting. This slide presents the high-level steps of the study that were undertaken to address the Commission's requests. Staff of the CNSC and Ontario Power Generation worked to carry out the study. Ontario Power Generation, or OPG for short, carried out the work with regards to the identification and modeling of the release, including the dispersion modeling and dose assessment. The results of this work, specifically the dose assessment, was provided to CNSC staff, who then completed a human health risk assessment, specifically increased risk of cancer incidents with due consideration of protective actions, and an examination of other consequences. Some of the other consequences examined included implications to emergency planning, psychosocial effects, and effects to non-human biota. When we use that term non-human biota, we are referring to wildlife. To ensure that the study was robust, a source term of sufficient magnitude was needed, as was a wide range of release scenarios. A source term is defined as the types and amounts of radioactive material released to the environment following an accident. For this study, it was based on the magnitude of CNSC's large release safety goal of 1 × 10⁻14 becquerels of cesium-137 and was comparable in magnitude to the 10 to the minus 7 type of severe accident scenario discussed by interveners during the Darlington refurbishment environmental assessment, and was 4 to 5 orders of magnitude greater than the actual accident assessed as part of the aforementioned environmental assessment. The source term examined in this study is significantly larger than would be expected under any credible scenario. With respect to the scenarios analyzed, two key aspects describe the scenario, namely the hold-up period and the release duration. Hold-up refers to the period of time between the radioactive material being released from the reactor core to then being released into the environment. It is normally held up by containment prior to release in the environment. Release duration is the length of time that the radioactive material is being released to the environment. With respect to the hold-up period, or timing of the release, it was set at 24 hours for all scenarios, which is consistent with our understanding of accident progression at Darlington. To put the hold-up period into perspective, for Fukushima, despite the catastrophic conditions caused by the earthquake and tsunami, the hold-up periods range from 23 to 74.5 hours. With respect to duration, 3 release durations were chosen: short, meaning 1 hour in length; medium, meaning 24 hours; and long, meaning 72 hours in length. Scenarios, which will be referred to subsequently in this presentation, are referred to respectively as 24-1, 24-24, and 24-72. The generic large release was the same quantity of radionuclides released for each scenario, albeit in 1, 24, and 72 hours. To put the release durations into perspective, the 1 hour duration scenario would be comparable to a significant breach in containment, whereas the other two scenarios, the 24 and 72 hour durations, indicate partially or fully intact containment with venting occurring, for example. As expected, a short release duration of 1 hour of the entire source term will be more challenging to emergency response than the release of the source term over the medium and long durations examined in this study. With respect to the last bullet, we heard the concerns from interveners about the absence of a Fukushima type of release. Staff's position is that an accident like that at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant is unlikely to happen in Canada, reflective of the CANDU design and extremely low likelihood of an external event like the tsunami occurring near Canadian nuclear power plants. However, to be responsive to intervener concerns raised during the hearings, the source term was increased fourfold for 2 scenarios to be comparable to a common cause event affecting all 4 units at Darlington at the same time. Note, this is a simple yet conservative way of looking at a multi-unit event. That is to say, that is, if we used conservative, deterministic, and probabilistic safety assessments, the events leading to such a release at multiple units are either impossible or so small that they represent scenarios that are well below the ranges of concern and likely well below 10 to the minus 8 per year probability. For all scenarios, the release was in the form of a plume dispersed in the atmosphere. Now to some of the key study assumptions. A key assumption was to assume that radiological releases occur, meaning Fukushima enhancements such as emergency mitigating equipment were not accounted for and the source term was assumed to be released in its entirety. What does this mean practically? What it means is, firstly, is that we have an accident scenario in this study that is comparable to a 10 to the minus 7 type of accident. If operator actions and Fukushima enhancements were accounted for, such as emergency mitigating equipment, the likelihood of a severe accident of this nature would be lowered even further by a factor of 10 to be in the range of 10 to the minus 8, or 1 in 100 million, and be practically eliminated. Furthermore, the amount of radioactive material released would be reduced if considerations for interaction between radioactive material, containment, and other equipment is taken into account due to retention, plating, and other chemical interactions. In short, the source term is significantly larger than would be expected under any credible scenario. The second key assumption had to deal with the weather, specifically wind speed and direction. For the short-term release, referred to as a 24-1 scenario, wind speed and direction were constant. For the medium and long-term releases, which were 24 and 72 hours in length, respectively, variable wind speed and direction were used in the dispersion modeling. Lastly, it was assumed that protective actions were implemented effectively. That meant for all the individuals evacuated, meaning relocated to a safe area, they received 0 dose as evacuation was successfully done. For those individuals sheltered, meaning instructed to stay inside and take other measures such as closing windows, a dose reduction of 20% was taken into consideration. Finally, for potassium iodide pill ingestion, it was assumed that the potassium iodide pills are available to residents within the primary zone in advance of the radiological exposure, and that ingestion is done in a time frame prior to or immediately after exposure, resulting in a complete elimination of dose to the thyroid. With respect to the human health results, the excess future cancer risk attributed to the radiation exposure from the accident scenarios was compared to the baseline future risk, that is, the risk in the absence of radiation exposure from the accident. The key study findings were that it would be nearly impossible to distinguish most radiation-induced cancers from baseline cancers examined in this study, that is, all cancers combined, leukemia, and adult thyroid cancer. Of note, childhood thyroid cancer is the only radiation-induced cancer that could be distinguished from baseline cancers. Increased risk for the childhood thyroid cancer was predicted for all scenarios. For example, in the 24 times 4 scenario, where the source term was increased 4-fold, the predicted excess future risk of developing childhood cancer was an additional 0.3% above the baseline future risk of approximately 1% in close proximity to the plant. This led to the study recommendation that the consideration of sensitive receptors, such as children, be an important aspect of emergency planning. To recap some key milestones, the draft study was presented to the Commission during the June 19, 2014 meeting. Concurrently, the draft study was out for public consultation. As requested during the Commission meeting and documented in the minutes of that meeting, CNSC staff was to update the Commission on the results of the public consultation. The public consultation period ran from June 4, 2014 to August 29, 2014. The public consultation notice was published on CNSC's website and was also made available through CNSC's subscription list. The draft document was available in both official languages upon request. A total of 59 requests for the draft study were received. 505 submissions were received on the draft study. 486 of them appeared to be part of a letter writing campaign organized by Sierra Club, which focused on the severity of the accident assessed. The remaining submissions came from members of the public, industry, non-governmental organizations, and provincial and federal government. Industry comments came from Bruce Power, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, now known as Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, and Ontario Power Generation. Examples of non-governmental organizations included Greenpeace and the Canadian Environmental Law Association. The federal government comments came from Health Canada, and the Ontario government comments consisted of a joint submission from the Office of the Fire Marshal and Emergency Management and the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. CMD 15 M10 is structured in 3 main parts. First, the body of the CMD itself, which is a high-level summary of the public consultation and CNSC staff responses to direction from the Commission and key concerns raised by the public and others. Secondly, CNSC staff dispositions to the comments received during the public consultation period on the draft study, which forms Addendum A. Finally, the revised draft study of consequences of a hypothetical severe nuclear accident and effectiveness of mitigation measures forms Addendum B. The next few slides deal with how CNSC staff addressed the direction from the Commission, focusing on the key ones. Note that not all aspects are discussed in this presentation, but all are addressed in the CMD. The first direction from the Commission to be discussed is that around protective actions and protective action levels, or PALs for short. This slide provides some context and shows that protection action levels are based on a dose or dose range that have been established for Ontario Provincial Nuclear Emergency Response. The Ontario Provincial Nuclear Emergency Response Plan is intended to be flexible, and it is for this reason that the evacuation and sheltering PALs are reported as a range. For example, for evacuation, it ranges from 10 millisieverts to 100 millisieverts whole body doses. What does this mean from a nuclear emergency response? Practically, in the event of an incident, initial modeling and or measurements will help predict doses at certain distances, and those predictions are compared to the PAL values to help determine what protective action may be needed. In addition, there's the thyroid blocking PAL, also known as potassium iodide pill ingestion, of 50 millisieverts, which is in alignment with international and national guidance. The Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care has responsibility when it comes to deciding on the administration of potassium iodide in Ontario. The direction from the Commission on this matter was to look at what would happen to the risk estimates if there was a change to the doses used to implement the protective actions. For the purpose of our study, we had based hypothetical decisions regarding evacuation and sheltering on the lowest dose in a given range. For example, since the PAL for evacuation is 10 to 100 millisieverts, it was assumed that if doses were projected to be above 10 millisieverts, then the decision to evacuate would be undertaken. Using this PAL, 12 kilometers was the greatest distance to be evacuated, which is analogous to the primary zone in this study for the 24-1 scenario. All other scenarios would require a smaller evacuation distance. At the Commission's request to address the impacts of basing decisions on larger doses within the PAL range, we assessed the impact of assuming that evacuation would take place only at projected doses of 100 millisieverts and above, and sheltering would take place at projected doses of 10 millisieverts or above. This analysis is presented in Section 7.2 and Annex 6 of the report. The results of this assessment indicated that the size of the area to be evacuated did not change or changed very little for all scenarios, with the exception of the 24-1 scenario. For that scenario, the size of the evacuation zone was reduced from 12 kilometers to 1 kilometer. What does this mean from a health impact? Is that more of the population may receive a dose, and the individual doses may be higher, although not significantly. This would translate directly into a greater theoretical cancer incidence risk, albeit not one that would be distinguishable from background. This would be useful information when balancing the radiological risk, meaning dose and resulting cancer risk, versus the non-radiological risk, such as the physical and psychosocial effects from evacuation when considering a protective action. These non-radiological risks have been found to be real, given the experiences from Chernobyl and Fukushima. With respect to the scope, the study was updated to reflect that economic consequences were not assessed. This type of comment also came up frequently in the public submissions, and CNSC staff dispositioned these comments by indicating that it was outside the mandate of the Commission under the Nuclear Safety Control Act and explaining the legislation around nuclear liability in Canada. For the next bullet, references were added throughout the document, including to the information boxes where appropriate, such as health effects from Chernobyl and Fukushima. For the variability in human health risk estimates, CNSC staff have included in the risk tables in Annex 3 of the draft document the lower and upper 90% bound estimates that the radiation risk assessment tool, known as RAD-RAT, produces. As indicated in this slide, using the upper 90% bound risk estimates, similar results were observed. Namely, the childhood thyroid cancer was the only cancer examined for which increased risks were observed on the order of 2 to 2.5 times greater than that of the mean estimate. For example, the excess risk of developing thyroid cancer for a child from the worst scenario, namely the 24 times 4 scenario in close proximity to the plant, yielded a mean excess future risk of 301 chances in 100,000, whereas the upper 90% bound risk estimate was 773 chances in 100,000, and the lower bound risk estimate is 75 chances in 100,000. And all of this is relative to the baseline future risk of 1,078 chances in 100,000. In order to improve on the readability of the document, CNSC staff have corrected discrepancies, ensured consistent use of terms throughout, and added an extended, plain language executive summary and an acronym list. The draft document will go through an additional review prior to publication. As part of the minutes of the Commission meeting, there were commitments by CNSC staff to produce 2 fact sheets. The first one, a fact sheet on health effects of the Chernobyl accident, was published on CNSC's website on February 18th, 2015. This fact sheet was based on the latest United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation report. All the information is objective, substantiated, and scientific. The second fact sheet on managing public doses during a nuclear emergency is pending publication. It addresses the questions and facts surrounding regulatory dose limits and dose-based protective action guidelines. In conclusion, as outlined in CMD 15M10, all of the direction from the Commission has been addressed. The next few slides will now focus on the key concerns raised during the public consultation period and CNSC staff's responses to those concerns, including changes made to the study document. Note that not all concerns are discussed in this presentation and the CMD, but all comments are addressed in the disposition table that forms Addendum A of the CMD. Certainly, the number one concern raised was around the severity of the accident. There were comments around different aspects of this, namely, it wasn't a Fukushima type of accident, it was not an International Nuclear Event Scale 7 accident, or INES. The INES scale refers to the International Atomic Energy Agency tool for communication to the public on the safety significance of events associated with ionizing radiation, and it wasn't a multi-unit accident. CNSC staff's position is, in fact, the predicted doses from the studies are comparable to those measured at Fukushima, and we will look at some of those actual numbers later in the presentation. INES is meant to be a communication tool. It is not meant to be for comparisons between facilities, organizations, or countries, as some commenters are advocating. Further, Fukushima enhancements would reduce the probability of a similar accident happening to the 10 to the -8 range. And given all reactor safety enhancements installed at Canadian nuclear power plants in response to lessons learned from the Fukushima accident, the release of radioactivity of this magnitude, such as the INES 7 or Fukushima, is extremely unlikely, meaning an unmanageable natural disaster would have to occur. As the purpose of the study was to examine human health consequences, a highly unlikely generic scenario was assumed in the study that was reflective of a severe accident. For the purposes of this study, multiple unit accidents were looked at in a conservative manner by multiplying the source term by 4. It is recognized that there is ongoing work to develop a site-wide probabilistic safety assessment and associated safety goals that will provide a more realistic perspective of multi-unit accidents, their probabilities, and associated risks. Lack of an early release scenario was highlighted by a number of commenters. CNSC staff's position is that the 24-hour hold-up period is consistent with the current understanding of the release timings for the Darlington Nuclear Generating Station, taking into account containment and the vacuum building functioning as designed. The accident sequences in the Darlington probabilistic risk assessment that have an early release component are in the range of 10 to the -7. With consideration of Fukushima enhancements, such as emergency mitigating equipment, it is expected that probabilities will be further reduced to the 10 to the -8 range. When drawing comparisons with Fukushima, it is important to note that the large earthquake and resulting tsunami did not create these kinds of early release conditions. Rather, releases were held up in the different Fukushima units for different periods of time, ranging from 23 to 74.5 hours, with releases not occurring simultaneously across all units. As the purpose of the study was to examine human health consequences, again, a highly unlikely generic scenario was assumed in the study. Another concern raised was with respect to the lack of assessment of effects on aquatic biota, like fish, and drinking water. Additional information was added to the document, explaining that given the airborne pathway of the hypothetical release, considerations were given to the effects to terrestrial-based biota, such as mammals, which are more radiosensitive compared to aquatic biota, such as fish. No acute effects are expected to terrestrial or aquatic biota from the hypothetical scenarios examined. With respect to drinking water, there are provisions in place at the federal and provincial levels for emergency planning on this matter. Bottom line is that drinking water would be protected. In the original draft document, the use of the 95th percentile dose was described as a maximum dose to be experienced by a very small fraction of the population. However, while the 95th percentile dose reflects an upper bound, it is less of a function of the population or its distribution, but rather is tied to the worst-case meteorological conditions seen at a particular location during the calculation. This could be, for example, in an area with either a very small population or a very large population. Thus, staff recognized the need to correct the way this concept was described in the document, and CNSC staff replaced the 95th percentile doses with centerline doses to represent the maximally exposed individual. The centerline doses were slightly higher than the 95th percentile doses in the scenario that resulted in the highest doses, that being the 24-1 scenario, and was judged to be more conservative in this respect. Various parties had different views on the use and applicability of the study, such as its applicability to emergency planning, the use of conservative and non-conservative assumptions, and the absence of consideration of longer-term risks, meaning those greater than 7 days. CNSC staff's position is that the study is meant to address the direction given to them by the Commission and was not designed for other purposes. Though the study results are useful in support of other initiatives, they are not meant to represent specific reactor accident scenarios, nor be part of the actions emanating from the Fukushima Action Plan or activities being undertaken by other parties, such as updating of nuclear emergency response plans. Wherever possible, additional information and clarity was added to the study assumptions, methodologies, etc., to ensure sufficient transparency for parties that may wish to use the information in the study for other purposes. For example, more detailed source term information was added. The study focused on the risks from the first 7 days, which is reflective of the early phase of an accident and is in alignment with national and international guidance as a necessary and appropriate time frame to take early protective actions. The exposure incurred over the first 7 days could make up the bulk of the dose experience in the first year, depending on the emergency measures taken. CNSC staff are developing regulatory guidance on post-accident recovery. As such, risk assessment considerations that go beyond the early phase, which is reflective of 7 days in this study, will be considered as part of that future work. In response to comments raised on the lack of recent information from Fukushima, CNSC staff did a literature review and integrated the latest information as appropriate, such as measured dose information. A number of studies have reported on measured doses, and using dose to the child thyroid as an example, estimates range from 23 to 50 millisieverts. To put that into perspective, for the 24 times 4 scenario considered in this study, the average child thyroid dose was 31 millisieverts, which is within the ranges reported to date related to the Fukushima event. One of the key recommendations from the draft study was that further consideration of sensitive receptors in emergency planning may be warranted given the childhood thyroid cancer results. Several commenters indicated that sensitive receptors, such as children, are already a main focus of emergency planning. For example, Health Canada indicated that its guidelines for intervention are derived based on the most sensitive age group, using parameters recommended by the International Commission for Radiological Protection. Similarly, provincial authorities integrate sensitive receptors in emergency planning. For example, the Ontario Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care's potassium iodide guidelines. Given this feedback, CNSC staff added text on how federal and provincial authorities consider sensitive receptors in emergency planning and emphasized the importance of this continued consideration given the study's findings. Concerns were raised around the choice of the risk acceptability framework that was examined, the dosed inputs used to put risk into perspective, and finally the absence of a radiological type of framework. It should be noted that multiple frameworks for the assessment and management of health risks associated with exposures to contaminants have been developed worldwide. For example, we had profiled the framework used by Health Canada for contaminated sites and by Health Canada International Organizations for Commercial Chemicals. Additional information was added to the document to provide this context, including work done between the Atomic Energy Control Board and Health Canada. Further information around radiological protection frameworks, such as those from the International Commission for Radiological Protection, were added. The conclusions on risk acceptability did not change. For example, the doses predicted from the study are below the International Commission for Radiological Protection's recommended reference levels of 20 to 100 millisievert dosed to a member of the public during emergency situations. However, CNSC staff continue to believe that a public health type of framework provides transparent risk information that can be used by decision makers and is more easily understandable by the public because cancer risk can be better contextualized than a dose range. The next two slides will highlight CNSC staff's conclusions and next steps. I will now turn the presentation back to Dr. Thompson.
To conclude, this update in the form of CMD 15M10 and its addenda addresses the Commission's direction to CNSC staff to seek and incorporate public comments on the draft study, as well as to describe how the Commission's direction on the document was integrated. The document has been improved as a result of public consultation and direction from the Commission. In staff's assessment, some of the key concerns raised did not need changes to the document. However, the disposition of those types of comments in Addendum A provides a transparent explanation to stakeholders as to the reasons why. The next steps will be to finalize the study based on any additional feedback from the Commission and publish the study on the CNSC's website. Concurrently, work will be undertaken to publish the results in a peer-reviewed journal. This concludes our presentation, and we're available to answer questions.
Thank you.